One day, Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, goddess of harvest, of nature, of wheat, of grain, of all the growing things on the earth, goddess Demeter was the mother of Persephone. And one day Persephone went out into a beautiful meadow with her mother for a walk one sunny morning. Persephone was with her friends. They were on the brink of womanhood, adolescent girls, taking joy in nature and in the beautiful morning. Demeter was far off, scanning in the earth, checking everything was in balance, while the daughters played with the flowers in the meadow. Persephone was drawn to this beautiful flower. It looked so unusual and glorious, and the scent was just so opulent. She just was gravitating towards this flower. And she looked into the flower and smelled the beautiful scent. And then Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, suddenly was swallowed up into the earth through this beautiful flower, into the arms of King of the underworld, Hades, who had snatched her because he had wanted her for a long time for his wife. Hades, the king of the underworld, was actually the brother of Zeus, the sovereign king of Olympia, and was also the brother of Demeter, goddess of nature, of the cycles, of wheat, of fertility, of the harvest. This uncle of Persephone, this king of the underworld, had made a secret bargain behind the backs of everybody else. Demeter, mother of Persephone, didn't know about this bargain. Hades had made a bargain with Zeus, his brother, the sovereign king, and said, I want to have Persephone. I'm going to take her. And Zeus agreed. And this flower that was set in the meadow with its beautiful, opulent color and scent attracted Persephone in such a profound way that as she put her face into the flower to look at its glowing color and smell its beautiful scent, she gets swallowed into it as a portal, as a channel that draws her down into the underworld, where she was to be queen of the dead, queen of the underworld, wife of Hades. So this is the beginning of the myth of Demeter and Persephone, which is a really foundational ancient Greek myth. Perhaps you've heard of it in different versions. For me, this myth is the most, for me personally, the most important, most formative, most profound myth that I've been thinking about for so long, and still find it just full of the most rich, unanswerable questions and just rich material to look at over and over again. Before I continue, I just want to stop at that juncture to say a couple of things. So you have the beginning of the myth, which is this sort of idyllic scene of a mother and a daughter with her friends, her peer group, playing in the meadow. And then this sort of attraction that pulls Persephone away from her friends, away from her mother, towards this very particular flower, which draws her and provokes her desire. And then we find, actually, you could see it as a portal, or as a trick, as a ruse, as something to lure her into the arms of the king of the dead, who are in many versions of the myth. The main version, by the way, to read, if you're interested, is the beautiful Homeric hymn to Demeter, which is the version that I've been thinking about. So the flower opens, and Persephone's desire is evoked, and she goes towards it. And it's almost like, you could see it like a sort of rebirth, in that she's swallowed into something, into a flower. Like a kind of, well, and it's a very voluptuous opening, this flower that she goes into, and then is reborn but into the underworld. So it's like a inversion of birth. It's like being sort of pulled and born into death or something. It's hard to, I mean, I'm just thinking of it as an image of being swallowed up through a flower into the underworld, into the land of the dead. It's a beautiful portal. It doesn't seem sinister. It doesn't seem anti-life. It seems sort of this symbol of life, the flower, and going into the flower and being taken into this journey into the underworld. But there she is in many myths represented as being taken against her own will. Like in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, I would say, I haven't counted, but like literally more than 3 or 4 times, more than that, there's a sort of refrain coming from many different voices in the myth saying Persephone was taken against her will. Persephone screamed for her mother, and nobody could hear her. Her mother could hear these echoes of the screams when she finally realizes her daughter's gone missing, which I'll come to in a minute. But the point is that there's this complicated situation where she's lured through this flower into the underworld. But the myth states very definitively Persephone was abducted. In some versions of the myth, it's called rape, that she was raped by Hades. She was sort of abducted and raped and then kept as his wife against her will. So there's this idea of a kind of non-consensual coercion and sort of capture and an abduction that happens. But I think that is sort of it's true and really important to think about, and especially like her own voice in the myth says, I didn't want to be taken. He took me against my will. I screamed. She was melancholy. She was frightened. She was shocked, and she was calling for her mother. But, and I'm not undermining that at all, we'll come back to that. It's a crucial point. She was taken against her will by the king of the dead. But the way in which the abduction is, or if we call it that, the transition from one state to another, because it is a transformation in that she goes through this flower and goes from one state, i.e. the sort of earth, you could call it the middle world, through the flower into the underworld, that it's a transformation, it's some form of metamorphosis, but that it's her desire. And I just want to link it to Red Riding Hood, actually, the fairy tale, which I think resonates deeply with this. You know, it's a later resonant version in some ways, or response to this Demeter and Persephone sort of foundational myth. In that when Little Red Riding Hood is walking down the path from her mother to her grandmother, on this trajectory of giving the cake to her ill grandmother, she veers away from the path because she's seduced by flowers, again, like Persephone. So in Red Riding Hood, you have the wolf there saying to Red Riding Hood, look over there, those beautiful flowers. And she gets seduced and she looks at these flowers and she thinks, oh, I shouldn't maybe like veer off the path, but it's her desire is awoken. And the wolf it sort of draws her attention to the flowers, which awaken her desire, which then causes her to go off, you know, to sort of veer away from the sort of straight and narrow, to kind of make her own journey, and which in the end leads to a kind of rebirth when she gets eaten by the wolf and then gets reborn out of the wolf. So I just want to say that there's a link between Persephone and Red Riding Hood, in that even though Persephone gets literally eaten by the jaws of the underworld, which is actually like a beautiful flower in this myth, it is to do with her desire. She herself is attracted by the flower. No one is pushing her towards the flower. I mean, you know, so I think there's something really important to think about this juxtaposition, which we can't answer. One isn't sort of more true than the other. It's that they sit together, that the flower itself evokes her own specific desire, the color, the smell, everything about it just makes her go to it, and she is able to go to it. So she's able to experience her desire and follow it into the depths of this flower, which she then gets swallowed into and taken into the underworld. So yes, she doesn't want to go, she says, he took me without my consent. I was abducted, and it's sometimes called rape and considered violent. So we really have to hold that in mind. But then next to it is this kind of absolute her desire that's evoked through this pungent kind of beautiful, voluptuous flower. So Persephone swallowed through the flower into the underworld, into the arms of her uncle, which is, extremely. Remember, we're in the realm of Greek myth, but it's of course, it's got undertones of rape and incest and violence and lack of consent. All of those things very, very much in the myth. We're not putting that onto the myth. It says very strongly about the sort of problem of the fact that she was taken unwittingly. So meanwhile, Demeter, the goddess of nature, suddenly hears an echo that her daughter is sort of screaming. She runs to try and find her daughter, and she can't find her daughter anywhere. And Demeter's fury and shock and fear and panic just rises up in her, and she's a goddess, and so she's able to literally scan the whole earth to look for her daughter. She asks all the animals and all the insects and all the plants. She speaks to them and communes with them to say, where's my daughter? Somebody tell me, where is my daughter? No one can say, no one has seen. And Demeter's rage and brooding and mourning just grows and grows and grows to proportions that I can't even express in words. She's looking around the whole earth for her lost daughter. And as she begins to realize that her daughter is nowhere to be found, the fury rises to such an extent that she goes to all the gods and says, where's my daughter? She goes to Helios, the sun, who sees all. And together with Hecate and the sun, they tell her, they say, explain that Hades has abducted her. When she hears that her daughter has been abducted to the underworld, which means that she can't rescue her. It's not like she's just somewhere and she can find her. Being taken to the underworld is pretty definitive. And so she goes to her brother, Zeus, and she goes up to him and she says, you give me back my daughter. This is absolutely disgusting. What kind of bargain was this? What kind of atrocious crime have you committed by allowing your brother Hades, the king of the underworld, to snatch my daughter, my beautiful daughter Persephone, and abduct her against her will and take her as a queen of the underworld when she belongs here in the light with me? And Zeus is like, calm down, Demeter, it's okay, and sort of tries to sort of placate her in some way and says, there's nothing I can do. Like, I agreed to it, and this is what's happened, and Hades has her now, and there's nothing I can do. And so Demeter goes away from Olympus after hearing this, and she decides that if she doesn't get her daughter back, she's going to literally end the seasons. I think this bit's really interesting, that she's willing to end the world. She's willing to create a human genocide to literally end planet Earth, end the world, end the mortal life, stop the seasons. Everything will die on the earth completely from her intention, because of her daughter being stolen away by her two brothers without her knowing. And this is her act of absolute, what do you call it? I don't know the word to describe the act that Demeter says she's going to do, which is to end the world, and she doesn't get her daughter back. Like absolute, like the ultimate, going all the way with a protest against this unfair transaction that has caused this loss of her daughter and this abduction. So she goes around, Demeter, beautiful goddess of nature, radiant, to do with fertility and life and the natural world, goes around the earth brooding. No longer will she even look up to the sun. Her eyes are downcast. She wraps herself up in cloaks and sort of conceals her identity as Demeter, and roams the earth in a state of absolute deep sorrow, grief and mourning. And one day she's sitting at a little town just outside Athens, Elefsina, and she's sitting there and she's brooding, and the melancholy is reaching depths which are unspeakable. She's sitting next to a beautiful well, and as she's sitting, weeping tears of deepest sorrow and grief for her daughter, who she cannot get back, brooding over the injustice of this abduction and this loss, some young women come with jars on their heads to collect the water from this well, and they ask her, you know, they don't know she's Demeter, they just think she's an old woman sitting there because Demeter has made herself seem like a just mortal older woman. And they ask her if they can help her. And Demeter, still disguising her identity, tells these young women that she's sort of from Crete and wandering and needs some work or needs some shelter. And so these young women's mother has just had a baby, and she needs someone to look after this baby. And so they say to Demeter, well, you could come and be a childminder and stay with us for a while. And Demeter says, yes, go and tell your mother that I'm available. Now, this bit of the myth really interests me. It's not a bit of the myth which gets much airing. It's when people retell this myth or they know it from different sources, the focus is very much, as you can imagine, on Persephone being abducted by Hades into the underworld, and then how Demeter attempts to get her daughter back, which we'll come to in a minute. But there's this interlude in the myth that's in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which is the main text which expresses the whole narrative of this myth. And it's an interlude which has actually engaged my thought for a long time. I really couldn't get my head around it at all, about what it was really sort of doing or what I thought about it. But I have some thoughts about it now. So what happens is that in her absolute deep grief, Demeter, the mother who's lost her daughter because of this transaction between her two brothers. So again, it's like coming back to this ultimate sort of underlying structure of patriarchy, whereby the exchange of the woman between two men is the sort of ultimate underlying bedrock of the system of exchange that underlies that system of patriarchal control. So Demeter decides to, while she's in her grief, while she's thinking what to do perhaps, she decides she wants to become a childminder as a mortal woman. And so she's sort of in a kind of humble abode, and she becomes a childminder for this family. And she gets given this baby boy, just born, recently newborn baby boy, that's very cherished from that family because it's a late child, apparently, it says in the myth. The mother's had this child late, and she's a bit exhausted and got a lot to do and can't really take care of this child. And so it's perfect that Demeter comes to be this childminder. And as Demeter steps into the house where she's going to be the childminder, the myth says, the text says that there was a kind of radiance that shone through into the house, so that even though Demeter was disguised as a mortal, disguising herself as a mortal, there was nothing that she could do to sort of disguise this sort of radiance which kind of shone and glowed wherever that she went. But this family that employed her as a childminder didn't really get a sense of the fact that she was a goddess at all, but there was something about her that they certainly noticed. And so the mother happily handed over her newborn son, cherished son, to Demeter to bring him up. Now, Demeter spends some time with this little boy, and what she does is she starts to try and make him immortal. It doesn't say that explicitly, but it says in a sort of more oblique way that Demeter started to sort of shine her energy onto this little baby, and that everyone around saw the incredible development of this baby into this kind of radiant, flourishing, incredible child that was still a baby, but people really noticed this kind of effect that Demeter's touch and Demeter's care was having on this son, and they were joyful about it. But one night, the mother of the little boy, and the little boy is called Demephon, Demephon. I might be pronouncing it wrong, but anyway, Demephon. One night, the mother of Demephon, who had given Demephon to Demeter to care for, she came down one night to sort of not spy as such, but to just was curious as to what Demeter was doing with her little boy. And she spied on them, and she saw that Demeter was putting the little baby boy right inside a fire. And so you can imagine the mother came downstairs and saw Demeter, who she didn't know was a goddess, or maybe she knew, but she didn't know. She wasn't able to really sort of trust that instinct, perhaps. And she was seeing her little baby boy being literally held in a fire. And the mother's reaction was to just scream and run towards Demeter and say, "What are you doing with my son, Demephon?" And Demeter's rage is sparked so extremely. She's so angry at being interrupted and not being trusted and being accused of doing harm to this child that she throws the child down. It's a really extraordinary part of the myth. I mean, Demeter's rage, the rage of the mother in this myth, is really not to be ignored. It's really to be looked at, because it's often ignored in all parts of life, actually, the mother's rage. But Demeter's rage, the archetypal goddess mother's rage, in the first instance, the rage in her response to her daughter being snatched by Hades and taken to be the queen of the dead, that rage, which evokes her absolute commitment to ending the world, to creating human genocide. That's the ultimate rage. Total destruction from her rage. And then this second bit, before she's done that, because she's still hoping to get her daughter back, when she's in the process of doing something quite secret and mysterious and sacred, and I don't know the word for it, but sacred, I guess, this process of putting this boy, little baby boy whom she's caring for, into the fire. And when she's interrupted and accused of harming the child, the rage that she expresses is so extreme that she throws down the infant. I mean, the infant's fine, someone picks him up and he's okay, but just this act of the throwing of the infant. This is a rage from Demeter that knows no bounds. This is a non-human rage. This isn't a rage which stops at personality or personal sort of trajectories around like what's going to happen to this particular little baby if I throw him down, or what, ending the world. She's cosmic. Her rage is cosmic. Anyway, she's angry because, and she says very clearly, she suddenly reveals herself at that point as Demeter. She suddenly grows into this sort of goddess, manifest herself as she really is. And the radiance shocks everybody. They all stand back completely in awe, in shock, dumbfounded by the beauty and the radiance of this goddess who suddenly reveals herself. And she says to the mother, how wrong you were, how foolish you were, how misguided you were to interrupt me, to not trust me, to come and look when you weren't supposed to. And not only that, once you looked, to not be silent, to not trust me. And actually what I was doing, says Demeter, is making this boy immortal, is breathing the divine fire into this infant in order to produce a divine boy. This is what Demeter was doing. But in her interruption, she's so angry, she throws the boy down, does not finish the process, and leaves Demephon as a mortal, cursed by mortality, an unfinished process, so that Demephon has to still live with death like all mortals, but he still has the touch of Demeter. It's really amazing. And he then becomes king of Elefsina later. That's another story, but it's interesting that what happens is that there's an unfinished process, but what has already happened, the divine light and energy that Demeter has been putting into this boy in this ritualistic process through the fire and her own energy is partly done. And so he's becomes a kind of hybrid creature, Demephon, of like having some divine and some mortal. But what was missed out on, and what Demeter says to the mother, is that if you had just like trusted, if you had just not reacted in your human way of doubting everything and not following your instinct. If you had trusted, then I would have made Demephon immortal into a god. Now that's incredible. So anyway, that's bit of the story is sitting inside the Homeric hymn to Demeter, in between when Persephone is snatched and when she's reunited with her daughter, which I'll come to in a minute. But I just want to draw attention to this extraordinary interlude where Demeter, in her deep grief, is doing this process of trying to turn this boy into a divine god, is as a response to the mourning for her daughter. And I've been racking my brains about why she was doing that and for a long time. And I'm going to come back to why I think that. Just want to finish the story. So anyway, after throwing Demephon down on the floor and revealing herself as the goddess and explaining about her daughter being snatched, she tells all of the people in that area, which is Elefsina, to build a temple to her, and that she will teach them the mysteries and the rituals connected to her, Demeter, to her tradition, and she sort of like establishes a kind of temple there, which is also something to think about and come back to. Off she goes and leaves that, and then is on her journey to try and get back her daughter. So again, she goes to Zeus and all of the gods who are trying to sort of say, Demeter, please come out of your mourning, because whilst Demeter's mourning, by the way, she stops all growth. So everything's dying, the seasons are out of joint, and all the grains are not flourishing, there's no fertility, and all the gods are going to her saying, Demeter, please, come on, you can't do this, you can't end the world. And then Zeus realizes that she's serious. And so he goes to Hades, the king of the underworld, and he says, look, you can't, I know I said that you could have Persephone, Demeter's daughter, but actually you can't. We have to come to some arrangement, because Demeter, her mother, is so furious. The rage is reaching all heights. She's going to threaten to end the world. And so they all get together in this, like, go back around the negotiating table, as it were, Demeter, Zeus, and Hades. And what's decided is, well, there's two versions of this. There's one version says that what they decide is, because there has already been a covenant, a kind of bond that's made between Zeus and Hades in order to the sort of allowing and condoning that he should have this girl as Persephone as his wife. He doesn't want to completely take that away, but he also listens to Demeter. And so there's this compromise reached, which all three of them agree with, sort of, on one level, on one reading, where for the spring and the summer months, Persephone will come up to the world, the middle world, to be with her mother and the meadow and the flowers and the sun. And for the autumn and the winter, she comes down, she will go down and fulfill her role as queen of the dead, as being Hades' wife. So that there's a kind of split in her life, but also it comes to then represent the seasons, that the mother-daughter relationship, which is what Demeter's really fighting for, becomes the sort of cyclical symbolism of the way in which the cycle of the seasons change. And so another version, which is equally as important, is that when Hades hears that he's going to have to give her up because of Demeter's threat, basically saying, if you don't give me back my daughter, I'm going to end the world, which is, I mean, that's something to think about, that she actually goes all the way with that. Hades offers his wife Persephone in the underworld 12 pomegranate seeds, and Persephone eats 6 of them. And when she comes back up to the earth, when the deal is done and she's allowed to go back to her mother, one of the first things her mother says is, did you eat anything in the underworld? And she says, yes, he gave me these pomegranate seeds and I ate 6 of them. And so that's pertained, you could see it as like 12 months of the year, and the 6 seeds that she ate meant that for each one of those months that she goes down into the underworld with Hades, and for the other 6 months she goes up with her mother. And so that these seeds are often represented as Hades' trick again. So it's in the actual text, it says, and Hades tricked her by offering, by sometimes it says, depends which translation you read as well, is that he forced her to eat the seeds. he forced them into her mouth. Otherwise, or another version is she ate the seeds, 6 of them. Again, it's this very powerful representation of coercion. And first of all, her abduction was coercive, and then the eating of the seeds was coercive. Or you look at it, or not, it's not either or, it's and. Yes, there was coercion. Yes, there was no consent. Yes, there was an abduction. Yes, there was a trick, the flower as a trick, the seeds as a trick, that Hades has to sort of, in order to get what he wants, just to sort of force himself on and coerce. And also, like, that's supported by Zeus. Anyway, she'd eaten these pomegranate seeds, whether or not she was hungry and thought they looked delicious in the same way that she found the flower really beautiful and went towards the flower. She was also, there was some kind of trick involved, or who knows. Anyway, she took these seeds which bind her to the underworld, so that feeds into this resolution that happens, which is that she spends half the year in the underworld as Queen of the Dead and half the year with her mother up in the light. And hence the seasons, when it's spring and it's summer, Persephone is with her mother, the fertility is erupting, and in autumn and winter, when she goes down into the underworld, into the darkness, into the shadows, the grieving in the morning is about winter, and autumn, when autumn, the loss, and all the loss of the leaves, and the life turning into death, and then the winter where everything's barren, and then again when spring comes and everything grows again, out comes Persephone into the earth. And so this cyclical natural cycle is represented through the separation and reunion of the mother and the daughter. And so this maternal genealogy comes to represent a sort of pure equilibrium of the seasons, which is so very beautiful. So one, and that's the end of well, that's one end, and it never ends, this myth, but that's the resolution, is this cyclical relationship that Persephone has, going rebirth and death, rebirth and death, birth and death, birth and death, as the seasons go. So she's representative of this kind of constant, eternal, cyclical death turning into life, turning into death, turning into life. And it's in the context of the mother-daughter relationship, which is significant. Now, in the background are these brothers, Hades and Zeus, who depend totally on Demeter for allowing the seasons to continue. Hence why they agree to allowing Persephone to come up half the time. But what I just want to go back to say 2 things more about this beautiful myth. There's so much to say about this myth, but in this video I just want to make 2 things clear. The first thing is that I want to just just bring to our attention this ambivalence between the sort of being taken thing and the desire being evoked. Because if you think about it, going under into the underworld and then coming up again, the resurrection myth, it's so profound in our culture. You see it in an earlier Sumerian myth of Inanna, which I'm going to do a video about, which is about the choice of Inanna, who's linked to Persephone actually, but it's a choice in the Sumerian myth that she wants to go to the underworld and die and be reborn again in order to experience the wholeness of life, you could say integrating or encountering the shadow world in order for the light to become even more light. So that the bigger the shadow is, the brighter the light, or the brighter the light, the bigger the shadow sort of idea. But that resurrection is a kind of like a sort of cycle of life that is allows Persephone and Demeter to encounter a much more whole sense of life. Because imagine if Persephone was just playing in the fields with her mother and her friends and she wasn't attracted to the flower. Or what if Red Riding Hood wasn't attracted to go off the path? That even though these deviations are represented as dangerous, i.e. Hades, the king of death, the underworld, and the wolf in Red Riding Hood, if there hadn't been a willingness to go into the darkness, into the underworld, into the shadow, into the jaws of the wolf, or the mouth of the flower, which is the arms of Hades. If there hadn't been a willingness of Persephone to do that, then we wouldn't have the symbolically, we wouldn't have the beautiful array of difference in seasons. We wouldn't have change and movement. We wouldn't have the joy of light in relation to the depth of darkness. We wouldn't have the full array of experience. So it's all about that, I think, too, about like, yes, she went against her will, the way she was taken, but what was it that allowed her to be drawn off the path? What generative desire was it that allowed her to risk going into the underworld and resurrecting, coming alive again in order to see the light? I mean, the resurrection is just such a crucial motif, and the fact that it's related to the seasons here, and also that it brings up this idea of femininity and consent, and it's just so rich and open-ended, and we can't really resolve it here. But I just want to come back to the bit in the myth that I was saying that seemed sort of odd and has kind of confused or sort of preoccupied me for a while, which is this interlude with Demeter and Demophon. Because actually, when you look at the Demeter Persephone myth, most people, the way it's been recycled and reproduced is that it's all about Persephone, and it's all about the daughter's resurrection, which it obviously is. It's about the daughter going into the underworld, becoming the queen of the dead, and being reunited with her mother. But it's so much a myth about Demeter. This is so much a myth that's generated by the actions and emotions and power of Demeter. Persephone, we hardly see her. We just see her being swallowed into the flower, screaming, being under the ground. We don't really know what's going on down there. She's meant to be melancholy and wishing for her mother, but we don't really know what's happening with her in Hades. We just know that she eats those pomegranate seeds and then she comes back up again. But Demeter is actually who the myth is organized around. And I just think that bit where she disguises herself as a mortal and takes care of this baby boy to try and make him immortal. Now, I was thinking to myself, like, is that because she's trying to like replace her daughter? And I thought, but why would she replace her daughter like with a small baby boy? Like, anyway, it sort of didn't kind of work for me. And then when she was trying to make him immortal and then she throws him down, I was just thinking the rage is interesting. But then I realized, or not I realized, but my thought about this is that her anger was a part of her anger, apart from the loss of her daughter, the effect of this transaction. What she was angry with is the transaction. The fact that this bargain between Hades and Zeus was sovereign, and that's what she was standing against the patriarchal sort of covenant which allows women to be the feminine and fertility to be exchanged between men. That's what she was also protesting against. But more than that, the protest was against this notion of coercion. Now, why is it, I've always asked myself in Greek myth, not just this Greek myth, but many, that Zeus, all the gods, the great gods, and even the mortals, they seem to have to rape women in order to get them. They seem to have to, like, if you think about it, Apollo and Daphne, like Apollo's running after Daphne, she's trying to escape. Zeus and Metis, running after Metis, she's trying to escape. They're constantly chasing and coercing women or goddesses. And this is just another one, isn't it? Like of like, in order to get what he wants, he desires her, and so he has to, in order to fulfill his desire, he has to basically rape her or capture her or abduct her. And like, where is there a, you know, the myth is constantly saying she didn't consent, it meaning her desire wasn't there, it wasn't seen. I mean, her desire was evoked in relation to the flower, yes, but in terms of an equal desiring sort of couple, just it's always the male gods are raping and chasing and coercing. And so maybe Demeter is saying there is something wrong. I'm going to end the world as it is now because there is something wrong with the fact that desire, masculine desire in God, you know, in the divine masculine, even Hades and Zeus, and mortal, which reflects that. There's something wrong with it in that the male gods should not have to rape women in order to fulfill their desire. There's something wrong, and so she wants to end that. completely. So maybe when she goes to this house and becomes the child carer of this young boy, and she's trying to remake masculinity, because I was thinking, why is she caring for a little boy? Is it to be replacing Persephone? No, it's not to be replacing Persephone, because Persephone can't be replaced. Persephone is her daughter, and that's how it stands. But this little boy, perhaps he's going to be, in Demeter's mind, the new divine masculinity. She pours into him through her own creativity and her own power and making and energy. She pours the light and the fire into Demeter in order to try and create a divine masculine on earth. Because the masculinity that she's had to witness between Hades and Zeus is just to do with like rape and coercion. It's not proper, like how divine can a masculinity be that has to resort to rape and abduction to fulfill its own desire? True desire, divine masculine desire, surely Demeter must have been thinking, isn't that? But the fact that her daughter has been the kind of at the mercy of these two male deities who have expressed desire through abduction and coercion, she's just saying no to that. And not, she's ending the world, but then she's thinking, okay, I'm going to try and make something of this. I'm going to create divine masculinity through Demephon here, that does not have to resort to that, to abduction and coercion and rape, but actually is a different version of masculinity in the body of this new child that she's blowing the divine fire into. But just as she's trying to do that, she gets interrupted by a lack of faith, by a lack of belief, by a suspicion of the mother. And it's as if she's just like, this world isn't even ready for this yet. So maybe that was the reason why she had this very interesting encounter with that family and with this baby boy. And she does leave Demephon on earth as with having partly some divine in him, so that the myth is left with, there is some hope, there is on earth, there is some divine masculinity in Demephon that's been put into him that maybe carries a kind of spark or a glow of hope that there would be a masculinity which didn't resort to an exchange system that exchanged women between men through coercion. So maybe there's hope in Demephon because of Demeter's encounter. And in the same way, there's hope because Demeter stood up for the mother-daughter relationship in relation to us respecting the seasons and the cycles by insisting that her daughter comes up to the world of the light and the sun and the fertility for summer and spring, but also recognizes the need for change and for facing the shadow and for resurrection. So altogether, in the end, we are left with a kind of respect for the cycles, which is in the context of a benign mother-daughter relationship, which can separate and come together, and separate and come together, as well as a benign and transformative resurrection leading to fertility and cyclical life, eternal life, and also this hope for a divine masculinity through her encounter with Demephon. Anyway, there's so much more to say about that myth, but I think that's enough for now. Thanks.